Okay, for this video, we are going to go over groups and components and how to use them in terms of workflow. So I'm making a new model in SketchUp. It's feet and inches, and we ought to see the old one drop away. There we go. And there's a new, nice, clean model. Groups and components are an important part of kind of figuring out how to make a model and how to add complexity to the model, and it's impossible to be successful without using them, and without using them in a way that's rational and makes sense. So we're going to make a few columns, and I'm going to make some rectangular columns here. We're going to start with 1. I don't really care what the scale is, but let's call it that. And we'll just go ahead and extrude it up with the push-pull tool. So I've got a long, skinny, flat column. Now, if I need a bunch of these, selecting them can be a real problem. And I'm going to make 5 here with the move/copy tool to demonstrate why this is a necessary function in SketchUp, and it's similar in other programs too. We're trying to select, let's say, the back column here. I've got to really kind of work to get a nice clean view to be able to select that whole column, and it's really easy to accidentally select bits of the adjacent column. So one of the ways we kind of work on elements within elements is we use groups. In this case, I'm going to group the last of the columns, and I'm going to kind of maneuver carefully so that I can select it all, so every line and every face is selected. Then I'm going to go to that second order function, which I get to with a right click on the object. It's important to know that if you right click off the object, it simply deselects the object. It doesn't know what you want to do. So when you select it, you need to right click on the object, and we get this second order of functions. Now we're going to start with groups. I'm going to make this into a group, and it's already done. Just click on group, makes it into a group, and if I click on this one, I can see I'm clicking on a bunch of different components, but if I click on this one, it all highlights. It all highlights evenly. And I can't click on any of the faces. So if I wanted to, say, paint the face of one of these columns, I'm not going to be able to pick that face to paint it without first diving into the group. So to do that, we double click, and you'll see that it gets a dashed box around it and that everything else turns gray. Now I can select the face within that group, and I can select any face or line, and I can use the window tool the way that I have. Now, to get out of the group, generally you have to double click or single click outside of the box. So if you're ever stuck inside a group, just zoom out and you can get out of the group. Additionally, I could elect to paint a whole group, and it'll paint every facet of that group. So I'm going to make a copy of this group with the move copy tool, and I'm going to kind of make another row here, and again just going to do 5 equal columns here, and I can select one or more of those without necessarily having to maneuver around to carefully select it. Additionally, if I were to take one of these columns and move it to where it intersects another, we see that the faces actually split. With a group, that's not the case, so long as you're not inside the group anyways. If I move this group similarly to where it overlaps, it does not split the faces. Each group lives independently, and I can then pull that group back. Over here I cannot. The only way that I could separate these things is to reconstruct it, more or less, or Control Z, but if I try to move these away, it's going to start to stretch it. Or I might even have to try to copy it out and then erase the lost pieces and reconstruct it. But you see how those intersect and these don't. There's reasons why you don't want pieces to intersect, and you want those pieces to stay intact. So again, to work on any component of this group, I can go in and click on the group. Everything else around it is gray. Now, the next step is making groups within groups. So maybe I want all of these columns to essentially act together and move together. I can select them all and make those into a group. So now this has a second order group. So when I click on it, it's surrounded by a blue box, and if I double click in it, I have access to each one of these things, and they behave as they did before. Now, because the original one, I painted this face individually, when I go to repaint the group, it's going to leave that. If I want to change that face individually, I would need to go in there individually and do it. So again, we can go inside a group within the group. Now, you really want to be careful about making too many groups within groups. For instance, if I pick all of these, you probably don't want to go more than an order of 3. You see how I can go in that box, and I can go in that box, and I can go in that box. And nesting too many groups can become problematic. So be mindful of how many groups within groups you're making, and try to keep that limited to a certain number. Now, what do I do to ungroup things? We select the group, we right-click, and we hit explode, and that will take the outermost order. Or I could explode an individual piece within it. So this is still a group, but inside this group, this is no longer a group. So right-click, explode undoes groups. Okay. Now let's do this again. This is one of my last unmodified columns here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this one out. And let's sit that. Well, there we go. Let's sit that thing over here. So this has not been grouped, or it was grouped in the meta group and then exploded. So this is an individual tile. So let's go to components. So I'm going to select it as before, right click, and then I'm going to say make a component. It'll usually ask you some stuff here, but you can say it's sticky to certain surfaces, but typically none is appropriate. The face the camera, that's what that little cutout guy is, but it is predefining this as component number 1. In a real complex model, you might want to label these things. They show in the entity properties, but I've never had much use to labeling them, so just hitting OK is fine. Now, like this one before, this group looks more or less like a group, and the only way we can tell if it's not is by going to the entity button, and it says solid component here. So let's copy this one 5 times, just as we did before. And each one of these is now a component. There's no difference between the first one and the second one and the third one, except for now when I pick a surface here, notice that all those other surfaces are selected. So I'm going to paint this just so it's demonstrated easily here. Additionally, if I change one of them, it's going to change them all. Now, these are not all slaves to the original one. Each one has the same operability to the component. Okay? So, this is handy for all sorts of things. Maybe if you're making columns and all the columns need to be the same height, rather than making a group, I'd make a component. And then if I have to adjust the height later, I can kind of adjust them all together. What if I need to make this one taller than the rest, just like I did before? If I go and I try to do that, it's going to change them all, but I only want to do it to this one. So what we can do there is we can right-click on the component, say make unique, and that makes it its own component, separate from the rest of them. I've got to click inside of it to do so, but it's not selecting the tops of those other ones. It is, in fact, still a component, and if I copy it out, it is a group of components that should act in concert. So when I pick the top of this one, it picks the top of them all. Now, components and groups can work together. For instance, I can group all of these components so that maybe they move together. There's still components buried in a group, and I still have, let's try that again. I still have operable dealings with them. Components like groups also won't intersect, so if I take this group, make this into a group, and intersect it with the next group, they won't actually intersect the faces, they just coexist. And they're still maneuverable individually there. So, components are the things that you have many of that you'd like to change together or paint together, and you use groups to separate building components, particularly those that are more intricate, so that you can move them within, in, and around, and copy throughout your project. Might be a great thing for beams, columns, steps, things like that. You really want to group. If you reference the Confluence Part Follow Me tool video, you'll see how I effectively used groups in a model to reduce redundancy. Remember, the brilliance here is we don't have to model things that repeat more than once. We model them once and we copy them. So this is just another order of efficiency that we can get in SketchUp. So I'd like everybody to take a little bit of time and let's do the column game and build different kinds of columns and groups and components and explode them and get a sense of how those things are working.